We are live.
Oh,
Oh, there we go.
Here we are.
Welcome. This is Pat O'Meara. I'm the chairman and CEO of Inveniam Capital Partners, and I'm joined by a bunch of our friends talking about consensus mechanisms in a network. And this matters as more and more assets go on chain and real world assets go on chain. The question is, do we care about what the consensus mechanism is? Is that going to matter? What has driven adoption of various chains to date, and how are we using these chains natively from their core functionality for different types of assets? And is consensus mechanism, meaning proof of work, proof of state, proof of authority, is that going to matter? And we have a whole bunch of great folks here. We have, why don't I just walk everybody through here and ask you to give a quick introduction, and then we're going to go all the way through and do a deeper dive on what we do. And so, Ian, I'm going to start with you, brother. Give us a quick introduction of yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Pat. My name's Ian Northon. I'm a co-founder and chief legal officer for a Bitcoin mining pool called Ocean. We're at ocean.xyz. And my background is in the law, but I've also been focused on Bitcoin and other technology since I was a kid. And now, as new technologies roll out, I try to stay up with the Joneses, right? Try to keep up.
So good. Thank you, brother. Jay, you're up.
I'm Jay Smith. I'm with DeFi Devs. We were the force behind launching the Accumulate blockchain, and before that, the Factom blockchain, which I've been doing blockchain since 2018. And before that, spent years doing big financial systems. I'm a technologist.
Jay, it's great to have you, buddy. Thanks so much for being here. John, would you give a quick introduction?
Hey everyone, my name is John. I run the ecosystem engineering team at the Solana Foundation. Been there for a couple of years, and my focus is really to understand products and businesses first and work backwards on their dreams and visions and figure out where blockchain fits. Sometimes it doesn't, that's fine, but where it does, I want to figure out how to apply it with maximum leverage. Great to meet you all.
Thanks, buddy. Annelise.
Hello, everyone. Annelise Osborne. I just today announced that I have joined Cadena, which is a scalable proof of work public blockchain. And as chief business officer, previously I was at Arca. I've been in this space since 2018, and my real focus is how do we upgrade finance. And so I'm very excited to roll that out with Cadena. Really focused on institutional building. Historically, they've been more focused on working with devs and creating different projects in the DeFi space.
Fantastic. Thank you. Pat Campos.
Thanks, Pat. First of all, good to be here with everyone. I'm Patrick Campos. I'm president and co-founder of Chimera, which is a strategic advisory network. I've been in the blockchain space since really around 2017 specifically. The first 6 of those years really focused on the institutional application of blockchain in my role as chief strategy officer of Securrency. Like Ian, I have a legal background. I try not to say it publicly, and if I do, I say I'm a recovering lawyer. But that's me.
Fantastic. Kevin.
Kevin Cuddeback, chief data scientist at Inveniam. My role is very often sort of sales engineer or understanding how technical solutions meet our customer needs. So it's real exciting to be on with technical people today. And I'm thrilled that I've ended up in either Alice's Square or Paul Lynn's in the middle of the feed. So
that's awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Albert.
Thanks, Pat. My name's Albert Berdellans. I run the AI division at Inveniam. I spend most of my day explaining to AI maximalists why more data and more compute won't solve the entire world's problems.
There you go. There you go. And I think I'm going to use that as a touch-off point for us to kind of kick off and really dive into the meat of the subject, right? I think that it would be obtuse to not acknowledge that Bitcoin has transformed the world financial markets, right? The trading of value 24/7, 365 in a decentralized manner has upended finance at scale. And how we think about value trading is really been reshaped by that. And Ian, I'm going to go to you at Ocean. Give us another 30 seconds on Ocean as a Bitcoin only company that is built to preserve the decentralized nature of Bitcoin.
Sure. Thanks, Pat. So, Bitcoin really tried to solve, and why it was so innovative and revolutionary, it tried to solve how do you deal with consensus when you don't trust the other party, or maybe you don't want to trust the other party. And, it started, as a peer-to-peer financial network, and it's still working that way. And that's what it's intended to do. And as over time, as things get used and they tend to drift, we've been working to help Bitcoiners get back to basics. And so we opened up this pool just last year to help Bitcoin miners, who are an important part of processing those transactions, try to stay in a custodianless or a non-custodial situation. So they're not, Bitcoin was supposed to disintermediate, and Bitcoin miners, things have a tendency to concentrate or centralize over time. It's just human nature, and so they're more efficient that way, right? And so there are trade-offs between efficiency or scalability, and then the other parts of the trilemma that Bitcoin tries to solve, which is trying to have a distributed or decentralized nature and actual security, cryptography. So we try to get back to basics and help miners do that in a decentralized way, so that they're doing the intelligent parts themselves, so they're not relying on some third party like another pool to make the decisions for them. We try to do so in a way that was permissionless, so they didn't have to go through a particular jurisdiction or a government. As a lawyer, that was important to me. And then also in a non-custodial way, so that we weren't taking their Bitcoin. They were getting the Bitcoin or the rewards right from the network itself. We think those are important parts of trying to get consensus. Now, I say consensus because I started mining Bitcoin in my basement a while ago, and I thought I was part of the network, and I was part of the network, but I really wasn't part of the consensus network, because in some ways Bitcoin relies on people operating nodes, and distributed nodes. And so there's this great debate that comes back from time to time. Is it the Bitcoin miners that are processing transactions, or is it the people running nodes that weigh into consensus? And that's a deeper question, but as part of an overview, there really are nuances and differences there that get into the tech. And so when you focus on a proof of work network like Bitcoin, you have to say, all right, what are you actually doing? There's a lot of people who have products or things on top of that. And when they offer their product, you have to say, all right, are you doing what you say you're doing? Like people throw around buzzwords, like privacy, or they'll throw around buzzwords like decentralization. And it's like, well, how are you doing it? And so I think that's an important part of what we're trying to do, is making sure that participants in the Bitcoin ecosystem, in our case, understand what they're doing, and they're doing the heavy lifting themselves. And that makes them more independent, more free. And it also makes them better citizens, so to speak, so that they don't get, they don't walk into through the field and step into a cow patty, right? Like, you don't want them to inadvertently become subject to regulatory capture or some sort of mistake or some sort of security problem because they're not paying attention. Because technology moves fast, and you need to know what you're doing.
Yeah, that's right. And really the proof of work, right, which is, this idea that a whole bunch of people are going to race to solve a math problem, and they solve it, and then they get to decide, and they organize the block, and they say, these are the transactions that happen. Well, what happened is, with the pools, everybody kind of pooled all their hash power, but they consolidated the voting of the block, right? And what that does is, it's decentralized mining, but it's centralized control, and that's what Ocean is fixing, right? And
that's right.
Full disclosure, Inveniam is a shareholder. I'm a board member of Ocean, right? And Jack Dorsey led our first round, and we've got just some great people who are pushing this. But Ocean, you guys are doing great work. Ed, so great to have you. We're gonna introduce you. Actually, why don't you give a quick introduction of yourself? Thanks for joining us, real quick.
Oh, thanks for having me, Pat. Ed Nwokedi, I'm founder and CEO of Red Swan CRE. We are a marketplace of tokenized real estate. We like to decentralize real estate to make sure that it's open and opportunity for everyone to take part of, and make sure that the pricing of real estate is affordable for members and investors around the world.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're doing with this call in this podcast particularly is we have a whole variety of skill sets, right? Where we've got Pat Campos, who exists at what is commercially viable and philosophically a good thing long term, right? As you said, and what a great quote as we were talking ahead of time. But we also have technical, and when we talk about consensus is not only the market saying, here's the market price of an asset, but also consensus technically on how do we get these assets to trade. And we all agree that the trade is valid. And then the distributed network acknowledges the balances are correct, right? And so we're talking about consensus on the state of the asset. We're talking about consensus on how these transactions occur. And as more and more assets are coming on chain, more and more valuable assets, there really is a question about what is consensus? Why does it matter? And are people going to begin looking at proof of work versus proof of stake? Because the very first blockchain, Bitcoin, was proof of work, so you did not have to trust the other. Now what you're doing is you're trusting that people are going to act in their own economic interest, but people who stake a lot of money are making decisions that you're handing that proxy to, right? And this proof of stake versus proof of work, and that can be a distributed proof of stake or a lot or centralized where they're not so much. And John, I really would love for you at Solana to talk about how do you think about consensus from your perspective at Solana, and what has caused Solana itself to grow so dramatically? What have you done right that drew the market to you?
Absolutely. Happy to chat more about that. So just as like a high level overview of Solana, it's a proof of stake network, but we have an additional capability that I think is really important is proof of history. Proof of history basically allows for us to encode time in a data structure, meaning that we can effectively, like a metronome, everyone's on beat, like an orchestra, and we can keep going. We don't need to have an internal, like a global sense of time as long as we're on the same beat. You combine that with proof of stake and you get incredibly fast and cheap transactions. On any given day, Solana is doing something like 30 million transactions, more than all major chains combined. The point of this, though, is that this is in contrast with Bitcoin, where I would say that they absolutely should coexist. Solana is attempting to achieve globally synchronized state as close to the speed of light as possible. And so to do that, you have to have different decisions as it relates to things like consensus, because you need fast transactions. You need to be able to click a button and know that it's going to occur within the next 1 second, right? You cannot wait 5 to 10 minutes to send money from one person to the other. Not just money, but governance, doing other smart contract related things. So Solana has taken a very marked sort of departure from even the proof of stake that you see on EVM and Ethereum, in that it's focused on parallel execution. So you have parallelized transactions, and that means that if something is going on the network, there's a hot NFT mint or something like that, and over here you're trying to send USDC from one person to the other. These two are completely different gas markets. So this NFT mint might have a bunch of gas, and that might be expensive for that set of people, but USDC or other things happening on the network aren't affected by that occurrence. Combine all that together and we think about, hey, like how does this going to actually affect people's day-to-day lives for everything they do beyond just payments? And parallel execution just seems like a no-brainer in that situation. So I think that set of values around fast, cheap transactions that work really well has attracted a particular ecosystem of builders where the things that are happening on Solana are only possible on Solana, right? But that is not, and again, it's not against any of the others. It's just this is our perspective on products that we think will make an impact in the world.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, Albert talked about that he spends a lot of his day in his introduction. He was talking about spending a lot of his day talking to AI maximalists, that they will need something beyond just the world's greatest AI computer to function in the world, right? And, whether you're talking about in science, the fights between is light a wave or a particle, right? And, famous fist fights that occurred in Cambridge, right? That where they were fighting, and we find out it's got characteristics of both, right? Or in religion, G.K. Chesterton's example of a heresy is somebody who takes one truth to the exclusion of all others, right? And Bitcoin clearly has moved the markets, but is there other things in the markets that are happening that are collectively going to solve commercial needs in a better fashion in a new version? And I think Solana is definitively an example of that. And Annelise, you have just joined an organization as a proof of work chain. Talk about the needs in the market that you're fulfilling. And I think proof of work is very much part of your identity as a chain itself, right?
Very true. So the thought process is if we look at really what Bitcoin was built when it was built on proof of work, it was really built on security, right? Data security. It wasn't the speed as much. I think if you look at what's happening with I think if you look, most of the activity in institutional transactions or smart contracts is really on Ethereum. And I feel initially that was the only option. I think there's a lot of more opportunities now. Most of them are EVM. But what we've created at Cadena really are from the founders were JP Morgan in the tech group that had created kind of the first blockchains at JP Morgan. And they were really looking, how do we create a scalable proof of work that is fast. It's not as now. It's not faster than Bitcoin. It's not. I wouldn't say it's as fast as John's, but it's definitely for a quick transaction. But really has security behind it, and so and scalable. And so that's really been the focus and what we're looking at. And from my perspective, so I've just joined. I think institutions will appreciate the security that comes with the proof of work, proof of stake. I understand that Ethereum's gone that way. Obviously, there's a lot out there, but I don't know what's going to happen with. Are there problems we haven't encountered yet with proof of stake, right? With the forking, how is that going to work from an institutional perspective, where we're really worried about security as the number one? So, I think the jury's out on that, but the goal of Cadena is to create a scalable solution for institutions.
And I'm gonna come around, Jay, to you kind of as our last chain and as an engineer before we talk about the commercial side of this, right? As the commercial side, what do we think about this? But Jay, when we think about consensus and what chain should we use, how much does proof of work versus proof of stake? How do they exist in an oppositional or contradictory manner? How much do they work together in a contradictory or complementary manner? And when we think about proof of authority, proof of stake, proof of work, right? Is there a role for each one? What are those roles? And how do you, Jay, at Accumulate, think about your own consensus mechanism and providing a stability and a trust in the chain?
So we think of the world a little differently, because we are Accumulate is not another smart contract platform, which is not to say anything against smart contract. Smart contracts are one of the great innovations of the last decade, and they've created tremendous amounts of value. But smart contract platform, I spend most of my day working with institutions, trying to figure out ways to get around the limitations that are inherent in smart contract platforms. For them to do what they do, there's limitations, and we're working, Pat, with your organization Inveniam right now to get around some of the limitations that smart contract platforms put on custody. So we're a chain designed to really work with smart contract platforms to allow them to do the things they can't normally do, and thus, instead of being focused on accounts, we're focused on identities. We're focused on organizing data underneath identities. We're not focused on executing programs, and so we look at consensus a little differently, because we're organized differently. We're organized into chains with some hierarchical aspects. So at our core, we are a proof of stake, but also proof of authority, because we're identity based, and so all of our miners, all of our server operators have identities, but they also have stake. But at the same time, we're big believers in the power of proof of work, mean, there is no more secure platform in the world, at least in my opinion, and I think a lot of people agree with me, than Bitcoin. Bitcoin security is just astounding, and which is why we anchor into Bitcoin, so that we're taking advantage of that proof of work while at the same time using our own internal proof of stake. So we're kind of a middle of the road in this argument, and and one way we look at it is every business problem is a little different, and so our goal is to figure out how to provide a platform that's going to solve the business problem with the right tools and not be a tool and that is trying to fit every problem.
Yeah, and I think, Ed, I'm going to come to you, and then Pat Campos, I'll come to you next, but on this topic. But Ed, as you think about this, and you want your users, so in Africa, in the Middle East, in the U.S., security is the ante, right? And you're not, what you want is utility of the chain in order for your chain to facilitate transfer of value, where an investor can own a piece of a real estate asset, and your users aren't thinking about what is the consensus mechanism underneath. They've literally outsourced that to you. What they want to do is see the consensus mechanism on the state of data of the building, right? Hey, what does everybody believe that building is worth? Who are they that think that? What's the performance of the building? And they've outsourced the technical underpinnings of, is the change going to provide consensus when a transfer happens? And they've literally outsourced that to you, right? And as more and more assets come on chain, how are you thinking about what chain to work with? Because as John said at the very beginning, and I think this might have been before we went live, right? It's as much about picking all the function of the broad chain network as it is the underlying consensus mechanism. And I think that gets very much to your own decision making. And Ed, you're on mute. I wanted to.
Yeah, Pat, thanks for that. You're absolutely right. I think that at the end of the day, customers, whether they be sponsors who own properties who are now trying to raise capital by selling their digital securities to investors, or investors around the world who want to participate and own pieces of these real estate properties or portfolios, they just want to get it done. I mean, at the end of the day, they want to make sure that the transaction happens. And so whether it be on-chain or off-chain, the delivery of the final product is what everyone's concerned about. Most customers, I would say 90%, have no idea of which blockchain to use, why we're even trying to tell us which blockchain to use. That's totally up to us. So when we make a decision, it's really, I just look at which ones work, right? Right now, it's a simple process. We don't have too many assets. It's not like we have trillions of dollars of assets on chain. We're in high volume. We're actually putting projects on blockchain slowly, but we're really approaching some pretty good numbers. But it's not like it's too much activity that's clogging up the system. So it works. We can actually mint tokens, put them in a wallet, issue those tokens from one wallet to another, make sure transactions are recorded on the blockchain. But it's all behind the scenes for our clients. At the end of the day, we could be doing it manually and it would still satisfy our clients. So we just look for blockchains that we know we can trust, that others, corporations and entities are also trusting and using. We look at the kind of volume, the cost, of course, of processing transactions. Does it make sense? And are they going to continue to add value to the blockchain to make it more seamless for the end user? That's really the criteria we have. And then also, I want to say that regulatory framework is very important for what we do. We're selling digital securities, and everything has to be compliant. And so the blockchains that are actually trying to incorporate these regulatory frameworks into their process is also what we look at, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make the difference.
Yeah, and it really is interesting. The regulatory capture, there's a commercial reality, a market reality of where the market is, right? And where the functionality is and how it works. And, we can all use for those of us who, are and I'm going to put us in the same boat, right? Our age, right? Where the Betamax VHS discussion, right? Which for most younger people, even that discussion is too old, right? You know what I mean? That you know, everybody would say, oh, this is the better technology, but it didn't matter. Another technology won. And I think one of the things is the market itself is a consensus mechanism, right? And to not acknowledge that is to miss the boat, right? The market itself is a consensus mechanism. And one of the social proof you're looking for, what companies are using it, how are they using it, is that happening? And there's a consensus mechanism going towards it. But there really is a mechanism as more and more assets are coming on chain. And Pat Campos, as one of the founders of Securency, that's now bought by DTCC, the ultimate, you know, centralized ledger, right? You know, that wants to get into digital and saying, I'm going into this. You're advising a ton of clients nowadays, right? On how they put their assets, what do they look at? As you think about this, where does security and scalability come in?
Well, first, I just want to point out that back in the day, we had a VHS and a Betamax sitting side by side, so we were kind of multi-chain even back then. Let me take a slightly roundabout way. I did want to build on something that Ed said there, and it's exactly right. I mean, at the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road, the end user is not going to care until and unless something goes wrong, right? And then they'll say, "Hey, why did that happen?" And maybe they'll drill down, and that becomes an issue. So, on some level, these discussions are kind of, you know, the private preserve of you know, pointy-headed folks like us. But I would say, before we went live, I mentioned that I really do focus on, you know, what's commercially viable, but also what's philosophically good. And you have to start off with that first principle. I have a memory of being in a strategy meeting with a leadership management team, and they were discussing the mission statement, and the CEO said, no, our mission is to become $1 billion company. And I thought, oh, then they can sell drugs or weapons. I guess everything's on the table, right? You know, so what are you doing it for? What's the purpose? I also think that there's a lot of discussion around this that is led by technology, and then ideas come out of the technology discussion, which always strikes me as inverted, right? Because people tend to then begin to view these ideas as new, and they're not new. I mean, the Constitutional Convention was a discussion around consensus mechanisms, right? So you know, if you think about it that way, we're just really talking about, you know, what's the underlying ontological purpose for what you're trying to do, and if your objective is simply to become $1 billion company, you don't care how you get there. Well, you know, that creates a pretty wide open array of options for you. And if I can re-analogize it back to the Constitutional Convention, you say, well, how do we decentralize power? And then if you don't get it right, it tends to become centralized anyway, you know, over the course of time, right? So it reverts back to it. So we think about, you know, again, what's the purpose for what you're trying to achieve? And so in that, if you have a debate, you know, between, say, an institution that is in survival mode, you know, this technology, I don't know what it means for me, but I do know that I need to batten down the hatches and get my head around it and maybe slow things down. That's going to lead you to certain, you know, views on consensus mechanisms that are going to be very different from another player in the market. And so, but certainly the regulatory component comes in, and I'm certainly not someone who takes the view that regulation is inherently bad. You know, that we try to play at that intersection where we say, you know, do the right thing and, you know, try to, you know, get in the room with regulators instead of standing outside, you know, throwing stones through the window. But at the same time, you know, put up some protections as well, right? Because all of these things, and my biggest mantra is always, what often passes as prudential regulation is usually policy and politics, and so you have to keep that in mind. So in that, from a commercial perspective, I think that what is happening in the market, and I'm going to offend a lot of people when I say this, is that the shortest path to regulatory approval is, you know, permissioned, you know, and, you know, private permission, side chains, and everybody's kind of going there. But everybody says sotto voce, yeah, we're doing this until the regulators get comfortable with public networks. So in a sense, what they're really saying is, this isn't the consensus mechanism we want, but it's the one we'll live with until everybody else wisens up. That's a bet. I don't think it's a good bet, right? So I think you actually have to change the conversation fundamentally, and try to get the regulators comfortable with the right answer instead of just accepting the wrong answer and hoping that over time you can change it. That's kind of my view. But commercially, that's what we see in the market, is people are saying, well, path of least resistance, let's kind of go that route.
It's really fun to watch both Ian and John, particularly, who their facial expression and head nodding on the various parts of what you were saying with the Constitutional Convention versus the regulatory overreach that certainly got Ian smiling, right, about it's the wrong bet. But I want to take us next into Albert, right? And after we do this one more with Albert and Kevin, we're going to do kind of the speed round so we can get through 4 or 5 more. So we're not doing quite so much monologuing, and we'll do more dialoguing. Albert, this consensus mechanism, there's a technical consensus mechanism, but as you said, you're talking to AI all the time about where they're getting their data. And AI processing data and then feeding that into digital instruments, which is on-chain, is the future. If you don't think it's the future, you're smoking crack, right? It is the future. It is the future. And the mechanism by which you can have consensus that AI processed the right data matters, right? Did they get the right data, and did they process it correctly? And talk to me about that.
Yeah, so let's keep it focused on capital markets for a moment. A transaction only happens at the speed of its slowest component. So in many cases, that's a check waiting for 2 or 3 days for a check to clear. But the 2 or 3 days isn't really a big deal in the context of like a real estate transaction, where the slowest part is not how quickly the money gets there. It's the 6 months of due diligence you have to do in between doing the deal and actually closing. So AI has a lot of potential to speed up those processes, the data part of it, interpretation, analytics, and so forth, so that the transaction now becomes the slowest part. Simultaneously, it turns out that blockchain mechanisms for keeping AI honest, under control, and auditable are extremely valuable as well, because people aren't just willing to trust an AI model that tells them, do this. I need to know why. I need to know how. And then, of course, putting aside what happens when the counterparty has an AI model as well. How do you control the way that those two things interact? So I think AI plus blockchain is going to start getting a lot more attention as a topic of conversation as both of these mechanisms start being used for enterprise more and more often.
Yeah, and we began talking about consensus around the ledger, who owns what, right? And what that is, and how do we see trades execute. And Ed and Pat really live at a consensus on value and what does the market say this thing is working, right? And then there's consensus on the state of the asset and the data, right? And do we know where that data came from? Do we trust it? Is it processing and feeding in evaluation, so that there's a consensus on the state of the asset, consensus on the market, where there's a clearing price, where enough people are seeing it, and we're aggregating that so that there's a trade, and then a consensus of the ledger, who owns what. And I think that this consensus mechanism, whether we're talking at the ledger, whether we're talking at the price in the marketplace, or whether we're talking about a consensus on what the state of the asset is and the state of the data, all three matter. And Kevin, I'm going to come back to you for a comment on when we think about consensus mechanism, right? Proof of work, proof of stake, consensus mechanism. Is the market broad enough, wide enough for a real price and clearing price? Do we all understand the state of that asset so the market can actually work? When we think about consensus in the broadest possible way for digital assets to trade real value, which one matters the most? And not only does which one matters the most, can any of them operate independently? Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I think they all fit together in the puzzle that we've got to work that way together on the different markets forming out.
Well, I mean, I think the tricky thing is that a lot of our thinking around consensus is consensus that something was true, right? I mean, you know, what is the consensus working on? And then some of the interesting work being done now, and we're used to the idea that that a blockchain has to remember everything that has ever happened and make it all public so it can be revalidated. But a lot of people are doing some very interesting work teasing those apart, and I think this only works if we give an example of a successful teasing apart. So I would like to actually ask Jay, like, we all know how blockchain remembers things and proves that it did happen. Jay has a story about how you prove that you used to know this but have deleted it. that you know, people have data retention policies. Maybe for 7 years I have to not only prove that it's true but to be able to produce that. But after 7 years, I just want to prove that I used to know it and no longer do. And that, you know, in that moment, you see kind of the separation of these functions. So I'd like to just, Jay had an example about facial recognition, or, I mean, other things. I think everybody has something to play on this boundary to show why it's interesting.
Sure. Because we're focused on organizing data and governance underneath identity, we organize a lot of things differently, and we've separated consensus and validation. So validation is happening out on the edges. Consensus is separate, and the consensus data structures are different from the data things, such that the consensus data structures for the entire network is actually a very small data structure that can fit on a smartphone, such that you could take the consensus, the entire network consensus plus the identities that you care about on a smartphone, and have an active participative node running on a smartphone. But what I'm talking about is we've run into some cases where we're working with GDPR, where you have facial recognition, but you need to forget something. But the interesting thing about GDPR is that by asking somebody to forget something, in most cases, guaranteeing that they are absolutely going to remember it, because they have to be able to prove that they forgot it. And how can they prove they forgot it if they don't know what it is that they forgot? And so, but because we separate the proof structures and the data structures, one of the interesting use cases that we're working with some folks on is basically we can show that there is a shelf there that would have held that face even though we don't have the face, so that somebody comes back and shows us a face and said, did you forget this face when we asked you to? We can show them, here's the shelf. As you can see, it's empty, but the only thing that could possibly fit in that shelf is this face, which we don't have. And there's a lot of cases where proving the negative like that in business gets really interesting. And because we've separated the data and the proof structures, even though we're a blockchain, even though we're immutable, because our validation is separated from consensus, we can, at the end of 7 years, throw away parts of the data but still prove that we had the data.
And this GDPR, that's Article 3 of GDPR, right? The right to be forgotten. And this is what Google was fined $5 billion for. What happened is they had an architecture that was created that proliferated the data in many, many different places. And then they're literally unable to put the genie back in the bottle. Do you know what I mean? Without immense, and this goes to the very core of why was distributed ledger technology, why was the message put in the Genesis block of Bitcoin, right? The headline about the exchequer bailing out the banks again, right? There was a reason that this technology was created in the first place. And we need to remember the philosophical origins and saying, let's not replicate the same problem in a bigger way. Let's be thoughtful about consensus mechanism, proof of work, proof of stake. Are we consolidating power? And I think that the thing that I want to ask the group, and we're going to do kind of speed rounds, and I'd love if anybody has an answer that they'd like to throw out. And actually, John, I'll pick on you as the first person to go, right? But when we think about parallel processing of consensus, right, what is the role that is not incremental efficiency of the marketplace, but is transformational about the market, that blockchain is intended to deliver, that particularly parallel processing can do? And what does it unlock and what does it open that really we need to be thinking about? This is a first order value prop of what distributed ledger was intended to do, right? And how do we need to be thinking about consensus if we intend to preserve the first order reasons it was created?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I also want to challenge the premise a little bit earlier about choosing between these two mechanisms, because it's just as much about the network that you're choosing and the ecosystem that you're entering as it is the technology, right? Like if we forked Bitcoin tomorrow and said, hey, it's the same technology, are you going to trust this? The point is that there was a network of folks that runs that, right? And that's the system, that's the ledger that has been propagated, right? I think about that for proof of stake as well, which is where is that network located, right? If it's all in AWS, you have another problem, right? So decentralization is certainly a spectrum, right? There is the Bitcoin, maximal version of decentralization. There is an SQL database on the other side of things. There's absolutely room to play in the middle. And that's where I think people should be thinking about, right? Is looking at, does this network have staying power? Is this actually going to continue propagating past 100 validators or 2,000, 10,000, all that sort of stuff? So I think all that does matter on top of the technology. To answer your question, Pat, on the parallel processing part, it's just about accessibility, right? I think that if you have everything that's happening in the world that needs to happen in a straight line, it's going to be, pretty wild when everyone is using that, right? So I think that for a lot of the long tail use cases for value transfer, but also just state transitions, state machine transitions, you voted on X or Y, it's not value transfer, but it is you as a person recording the thing that you want on this immutable ledger. That shouldn't contend. You shouldn't have to pay money or pay gas fees that someone's using to bid up a real estate market. They're just two fundamentally different things. So that's where I think parallel processing provides the capability to expand into a world where you do have every long tail use case on chain. Are we there yet? No, absolutely not. We're 0.001% of the way into anything crypto affecting the real world, in an everyday fashion. But we want to prepare for that world, right, in the long term.
So the follow-up question real quick. So could Solana issue a proof of work chain and still deliver its core identity as Solana, having a proof of work and a proof of stake? I mean, is your consensus mechanism part of your central identity?
I think it is, in that it facilitates the thing that we want to do, which has to be fast, has to be cheap, right? And the only way you can do that is you can't have a mempool, right? You can't have a system whereby transactions are just waiting around, waiting to be accepted. On Solana, transactions go straight to the leader. They get packed immediately, right? And that means that you get that feedback loop and you'll know immediately whether or not it's going to expire or not. So that mechanism, you need to know who the leaders are. You can't guess what those transactions are going to be. Bitcoin, Ethereum, they use mempools for different reasons. I think totally valid reasons. But for this exact use case around throughput and being able to say, it's not about the transactions per second, it's about the seconds per transaction, right? How do you know that you're going to get your transaction through immediately? You need to have, I think in this case, proof of stake plus some other mechanism to synchronize clocks.
I love that answer. I'm going to just go around the horn, and I don't even know if people even remember what my question was. I think
Annelise.
Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to add on to what John was saying. So one of the focuses at Cadena is how do we create a scalable proof of work? And we have multiple for parallel processing. We have multiple chains, so it can work at the same time. So there's not a queue for it all going through one. So that's just putting that out there. We also have Our transaction fees are incredibly low. Our speed, as I mentioned before, if you're settling a bond, right? A minute is not a long time to wait for a bond. A minute is a long time to wait for coffee at Starbucks, right? So I feel like there's different use cases. So maybe not as fast yet that we've developed as our layer one, right? But to John's point, as a layer two, there's different opportunities that can go faster. But right now, we think a minute works, and having multiple chains tied in together is how we've dealt with parallel processing.
I love that answer, because our view is different consensus mechanisms for different types of assets, for different types of markets that have different demands, right? And Ian, I want to go to you as a Bitcoin person. As you think about this, talk to us a little bit about, kind of what is the future of Bitcoin as the only chain that's going to exist? Will there be other chains that exist outside of it? And is the unique consensus mechanism of Bitcoin as the most secure network in the world, is that designed to solve every problem in the world, world hunger, et cetera? Or, what is this, what are the problem sets that Bitcoin itself is solving?
Well, I think John and Annelise point out that there's different tools. Like a carpenter will have different tools for the task at hand, and Bitcoin is really good at solving the ownership and double spend problem, right? The Byzantine general, the analogy, to take it too far, is like, when are we going to attack? And if we all attack at once, right? It's like a giant cannon, but it shoots off and it takes 10 minutes to reload, right? It's really hard to do anything other than that. Now, it's really good for that problem, and it's going to keep being really good for that problem, which is a peer-to-peer financial network. However, I can't imagine like a modern day war that's like got drones and missiles and counter defenses and things that move so fast and so quickly. That Byzantine general problem isn't that practical, right? Bitcoin will still, I think, will last. I think it's here to stay. It's good for rich people. It's good for poor people. And it solves that kind of bearer bond. Who's got the ownership, and is there a double spend? Now, for any other tool, though, it's not even a hammer, like where every nail, the old carpenter to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It is a sledgehammer. And so, like, if you need a screwdriver, or if you need 10 people with 10 screwdrivers hanging a sheet of drywall, you need different tools. And so I think there will always be an opportunity for good creative technology to do different things. But where you have to be mindful is, which tool are you using for which purpose? And I think that's where people get into the trap. You want to be mindful of that. And it really takes, you have to use all your instincts to say, all right, does this pass the smell test? Is it doing what it says it's doing? How am I approaching this problem? Do I use the sledgehammer, or do I use some other tool? And, again, I think Bitcoin's here to stay. That's why I'm in that space. But at the same time, there's lots of room for good tech in other near adjacent things, and it can be solved using creative approaches. You have to be mindful of what tool are you trying to use at what time.
Yeah, and Jay, you were building the nail gun, right, for this as opposed to the sledgehammer, right? When you were in the Accumulate network, talk to us a little bit about the core problem as you thought about Accumulate, what you were solving from a philosophical standpoint, where you said, this is what we want to be able to facilitate getting done.
Well, we wanted to be able to orchestrate, because we don't believe that there's going to be one chain or even one cluster of chains that's going to rule the world. The future will be heterogeneous, and various organizations are going to use different chains, and so any particular large organization is going to have to deal with many chains. How do you orchestrate that? You can build incredibly complex smart contracts and do a lot of things, but if I need to run smart contracts on multiple chains at multiple times to all coordinate together to do one thing, and I need to deal about identity, I need to worry about data. We're kind of computer science folks, and we think the smart contracts are a really good application layer, but for the future, we need a data layer in the blockchain world, and that's that's the way we think of things, is we're trying to provide a data and orchestration layer so that all of the things that people are doing on Solana and Cardano and Ethereum and can work together. And that's our goal.
Beautiful. Ed, you're building a business, right? And you're building a business on new technology because you see the future in that. But the problem with that is sometimes that technology is evolving right underneath you. Do you know what I mean? And so you're trying to build a boat or actually use the boat, and you realize that you're needing to switch out some of the core infrastructure of the boat, in the middle of the ocean, right? And that's exciting. Maybe not in the best sense of exciting. And as you think about what we need to do to bring about marketplace adoption, how can these chains support you? And as you kind of think 5 years down the road, what is it your customers are going to want to see? Are we going to ever have bearer instrument real estate ownership? Do you know what I mean? In some markets versus others. Do you know what I mean? Are we ever going to see? And I know that probably will never happen in the U.S., but you never know, right? But talk to us about that. Where is this going, and where is this leading us from a business standpoint?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to see that all of you here are really thinking about the future and how to make sure that things work. But I always, look at it from a business standpoint, being practical, solving current solutions. We look at a client, we understand what their problem is, and we're using technology to solve a solution. Sometimes we don't need all the technology you're mentioning. We just need the simplistic technology to get things done. So, real estate sells without blockchain. I can sell shares of real estate to 1,000 people without using the blockchain at all. But we're using the blockchain to make it more efficient. I think that people look and figure out, well, what's the pricing of this, right? We always have start with data that starts with price, with valuation. That's a verified piece of data that could be on the blockchain associated with the token. That helps people understand what they're looking at. How do they get their dividends? Is that going to be processed through the blockchain? Will I get it in USDC, or will I get it in fiat dollars? These are questions that customers ask. What happens if Red Swan goes out of business? What do I do now? People ask. So these are the real problems and real issues that I face and I have to answer. But we try to take things one step at a time. Because right now, like I said, the volume is not so overbearing that we need to think about speed, transactional speed, and things like that. We have to just think about the basics of, okay, we tokenize an asset. We want to issue the token. What data around that token is going to be relevant for the end user at the end of the day? When they buy, they need to understand, of course, the valuation. But when they're ready to sell, they have to know what's the pricing. Are the financial statements going to be associated with the token on a quarterly basis? At least they have some basis of understanding what value is. And then is there any other transactional information that could be associated with token to give them an idea of what the pricing should be today if they want to offer for sale? So these are the kind of things we look at on a regular basis to make sure that we are able to provide a good service to our customer. But, I think the basic things are, is it going to break down? Does it work? Can I transfer to other chains? Right now, if I have these tokens I bought on Red Swan, it was minted on Solana or minted on Hedera. Can I transfer it to another chain because I want to put it on another exchange to sell it because I think it might sell faster? These are questions that customers always have, and we don't have all the answers to these questions. You guys are trying to figure out these answers to these questions, but right now they're not problems for the customer, right? They're questions they have, but not problems. The problem they have right now is, am I going to get the tokens that I bought? Are they going to be in my wallet? Are you going to hold on to, or am I going to hold on to? These are easy questions for us to answer, and because that technology is available. One thing I like about the standardization for compliance, people complain about compliance in terms of regulatory, how complicated it is, but in reality, the SEC is pretty straightforward on how to be compliant with selling the security and who can buy it and who cannot. And I like that because it really removes all the noise from the equation. When you start looking about compliance around the world where there's no set standards, it becomes kind of confusing because you really don't know how to deliver a product to a person, if it's going to be legitimate, will you get sued or not? So I think, the fallback to using SEC compliance in terms of a process is what we're comfortable with. And we think that it works for today's world. And of course, things will evolve where maybe it'll be totally decentralized and people can start trading, and the mechanisms and the smart contracts will automatically do all the regulatory work that's necessary for the broker dealer. But that's not there yet. That's what you're building for the future. Right now, we need to make sure that every transaction by the broker dealer is reviewed and signed off on, and then passed over to the end user. So it's a little bit manual, but I think eventually it will become more automated using smart contracts.
And that gets to scalability. Pat, give me feedback. I know that we're down to a couple minutes. Give me any last comments.
Okay, well, I'm going to start with this. First of all, I'm going to go off script and say congratulations, Pat and team, for putting together a great conversation. One of the true joys in life is to be the dumbest guy in the middle of a really great conversation. So color me joyful. This has been really, really fascinating. It touches on a lot of things. I have many commercial comments. I completely agree with Jay's comments, and I think Ian, you were kind of making the same point. Horses for courses when it comes to blockchain's consensus mechanisms. What are you trying to achieve commercially? Drives that to a great extent. I'm probably going to go offline with John. He made a comment earlier that I just was itching to ask a follow-on question on, but I know we're running out of time.
Go ahead, go.
Well, it seemed to me, and maybe I misunderstood it, but it seemed, John, that and if this is what you're saying, it really hit home with me. But I think what you were getting at is that there is, beyond sort of the Bitcoin, everyone in the whole world is a bastard and I don't trust any of them model. You move into a different place where the actual persona or the character of the folks involved actually begins to matter, right? And I think that's where you were going, which resonates with me, and Pat will understand why. I think if Pat and I designed a proof of work network, it would be where people would have to summarize different pieces of Thomas Aquinas, and then we'd figure out, who wins on that basis. But I think that's what you were getting at, and that resonates with me. And I'll leave it there and kind of leave it as an open-ended question for you, John.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, the ecosystem really does matter. Like, the founders that you're working with, the companies that you're like, blockchain is a multiplayer game, right? The canonical state that anyone agrees to, whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Solana, or any number of other ones, again, like, if you fork it, you're basically having to choose a side as to, like, who you're playing with, right? You still don't need to trust them, but you still need to, trust that they'll play the game fairly and are there to help move things forward. If your company or your product doesn't need that multiplayer, multiplicity of partnerships or the permissionless ability to work with each other, and you just need to do things by yourself, you can build a sidechain. You can do other things like that. But when I think about permissionless, particularly on chain, you can do both of those things. You can have on Solana, you can have a token that only transfers between KYC'd individuals, or security things that represent securities tokens. It does not need to live on its own island. You can still play in this big sandbox with everybody else. But I think that's the thing that people miss. That you cannot quantify that on a chart. Who are you? What sandbox are you playing with? It's not just about TVL or volume or any of those easy things. It's like us talking here and like having this conversation and saying like, hey, we understand what we're doing and why we're building this technology.
Thank you, John. Any Annelise, any last comments?
No, I mean, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here kind of on my first day or my first week at Sedona, but I'm really excited about kind of where this world is going to go. I would say I think there's going to be multiple winners for building up like different chains. I feel like this is a community. Everybody works together where everyone's connected. And I'm excited to see what this year will bring for building.
Sedona's lucky to have you. Great job. Welcome. Kevin, any last comments?
Not for me. Yeah.
All right, good. I'm good with that one. Ian.
Hey, Pat. Can we agree? Is there consensus around the fact that Caleb Williams is going to be picked number one today? 100% consensus.
There appears to be ahead of time. Let's see what happens. Ian, quick, because I think we got 1 minute. Anything?
Just use the right tool in the shed, right? Just make sure you're using the right tool for the project. And measure twice and cut once. That's all. There
it is, Jay.
I like the fact that everything seems to revolve here around identity, which so many of the problems we're talking about are tied to identity, which kind of validates our choice to organize ourselves around identity.
Thank you. Albert, you have the final word, brother.
Well, I saw some questions come in about AI plus blockchain, and all I want to say is if you'd like to learn more about how machine learning and AI models benefit from consensus and authority structures that are decentralized, go back and watch our AI plus blockchain episode. I think it was 3 episodes ago. It's very informative on that topic.
Awesome. Hey, Ed, thank you. Pat Campos, all of you, thanks for joining us. It was a pleasure. We'd love to have you back. There's both the pros and cons of a wide group. It's just a pleasure to be with all of you and so many smart people who are moving the ball forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pat.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.